Hello, and welcome back to the Okanagan Reader. I'm your host, Jim Bowering. Today's reading is Chapter 14 of Green Comet, the first book in the Green Comet trilogy. This is the chapter where we make the transition from introduction to story proper. In Chapter 14, we learn about the visitor's intention, if not all about it. Do up your seatbelt. Here we go then. Chapter 14. The Visitor is Revealed. For a space-going species, there was no question that they would go out there. They couldn't just sit and wait when they had the means to do something about it. They had people occupying almost every comet of any size in the system. There were crews in the outer fringes, working at diverting comets that were calculated to pose a threat to their planet thousands of years in the future. There were 3 large comets occupied by people who were living on them for hundreds of years as they went through a complete orbit. Red Comet, the first of its class, was about to re-enter the realm of the planets and would soon be close enough to home for people to return to their planet if they wanted to. In just over 200 years, its population had doubled to about 2,000, and it looked as if most of them were going to opt to stay with the comet for another orbit. Orange Comet, which started with 2,000 people and had already doubled that, was approaching aphelion and wasn't concerned with what they might do in hundreds of years. Unlike the people of Red Comet, who survived by adapting their comet, those living in Orange Comet were experimenting with adapting their bodies. Conserving energy was crucial to living successfully on a comet, so they had fur for warmth. To see in lower light, they had slightly larger eyes, lenses a little closer to the retina, and a tapetum to reflect the light back through the photocells. They were always considering other changes. Yellow Comet had a planned population of 10,000. Red and Orange before it had established that large comets could support a few thousand at least. They both recommended starting with more people, because it was possible, and because they could use the extra hands for the work involved. Red Comet had found itself working far too hard with only 200 people available at a time, and had to accelerate the hibernation cycle to have more awake. Orange doubled the initial numbers, but still found they could have used more. With no shortage of eager migrants and the knowledge acquired by its predecessors, Yellow decided to take 10,000. Unfortunately, God's Purity Brigade had other ideas, so that decision only meant that more people would die. After a period of shock and mourning, the timetable for the next comet was moved up. The advance crew had already prepared it during its inbound phase, and it was decided that it would be a waste of effort if they didn't use it. An intense campaign was able to prepare and assemble another 10,000 people with just enough time to catch it. The transfer vessels were available, and the ships were waiting at the Lagrangian point. There was some discussion about the name. Should they still call this expedition Yellow, or move on to the next color? Finally, they agreed it would be best to honor Yellow Comet by leaving a hole in the sequence, and so Green Comet it would be. Green Comet was well past its ascending node, on a retrograde hyperbolic orbit, just outside the planets. Its orbit was at a 54-degree angle relative to the rest of the system, so its perihelion was south of the ecliptic and within a handful of astronomical units. Elgin and Francis first met while working on Green Comet during their first waking. Both had been among the 80% of the population that began the voyage in hibernation, so they started out with the fur and vision adaptations already effected while they slept. They had some further enhancements to Orange Comet's vision modifications, with more rods near the center of vision, and changes to the retinal light-sensing compounds to make them more sensitive. Frances was only in her early 30s when she was put on the planning committee, but that didn't surprise anyone who knew her. She had an apparently effortless ability to take in complex ideas and make decisions. She also had an easy way with people, who all seemed to love her. Elgin, one of her lead engineers, though only in his late 20s himself, fell for her immediately. But that's a later story. The people's substantial experience with space led naturally to the decision to mount an expedition to learn more about the visitor. In less than 5 years they were on their way, and in about 20 they were as far out as the Kuiper belt, though considerably south of the ecliptic, since the light was coming in at an angle to the plane of the planets. During that time, the light had evolved even more. The source, which they had been associating with a yellow dwarf star, was now known to be drifting slowly relative to the star field. It could not be associated with any visible object in its present position, but tracking its trajectory back showed it intersected exactly with the star they had originally identified. In addition, the intensity of the light was still increasing. There was a great deal of speculation about that, although the answer that immediately leapt to mind seemed too incredible to say out loud. Nevertheless, soon everyone was talking about it. The simplest explanation, therefore the one which should be favored even by scientists, was that the source of the light had left the star and was moving in their direction. The star and its neighbors continued moving against the distant stars as they always had, but the light was on a new course, directly toward them. On the Envoy vessel, there was naturally a great deal of discussion about the latest developments. The crew consisted not only of the usual navigators, engineers, and technicians. This was a unique flight of exploration and discovery, so the roster included scientists and other observers who wouldn't normally be there. It also had quite a few journalists who had competed hard for the privilege. There were even a couple of rich famous people who had bought their passage with money, reputation, and favors. Such was the nature of the voyage, though, that even they pitched in as part of the team, rather than being the prima donnas many predicted. The only flaw in their behavior was that they both resented not being the only famous person there. Being on a ship heading out of their solar system and into deep space, they were naturally less astounded than most to learn that the light source was moving away from its star as well. They soon found themselves assuming that it was a vessel of exploration like their own, and they looked forward to learning more about it, even hoping to one day meet the beings who had built and launched it. The next change in the light was more surprising than any that had come before it. They were only able to see it because they were so much closer to it, and even then it was maddeningly unclear. The spot of light, always assumed to be circular in cross-section, was beginning to show hints of a crescent shape. As with previous additions to the data, this one did as much to confuse as enlighten. What kind of light source was crescent-shaped? That was light reflecting from a sphere, such as one of their moons. Did that mean that they weren't looking at light coming directly from the source, but rather reflected from a sphere? To be a thin crescent like this would mean that the source of light was further away still, and that an incredibly powerful laser was being shone on a sphere for some reason. And the angle would mean that the laser wasn't being pointed in their direction after all, but it would also mean that the light, after being reflected, somehow maintained its coherency. No one could come up with a way for that to happen, unless the sphere was specially engineered to make it so. The ship ventured on, setting new distance records with every kilometer it traveled. It was all a routine now for the crew, in spite of the novelty and the mystery. Everyone alternated between waking and hibernating, working with a mixture of familiar people and new faces each time they were on duty. They were approaching the heliopause and termination shock when the next two surprises came a matter of months apart. First the light started fluctuating in intensity again, then it finally resolved itself. It wasn't being reflected off a sphere. The crescent wasn't reflected at all. It was light being blocked by something circular. The impression of a crescent wasn't formed so much by the light as by the darkness where the light was blocked. Once they realized that, they began to concentrate on the area around the light instead of just the light itself. A couple of weeks of intense observation revealed a shadow that occulted background stars as it moved slowly across them. It looked as if a circle of black was between them and the light source, blocking all but a little bit on one side, and now that little bit of light was changing its intensity with a periodicity similar to its blinking a few decades ago. This new information had the ship buzzing, and it had just as much effect back home when their message got there 7 hours later. This was even bigger than the strange light, bigger than realizing that it was artificial. This was seeing an actual object out there in interstellar space. No one, or hardly anyone anyway, questioned that this new object was also artificial. Something this intimately associated with that light was definitely of a kind with it. But why was it blinking again? On the ship they began waking everybody. Hibernation was a good way to pass long periods of time, but everyone had made it clear that they wanted to be wakened if anything happened. Finding what they were looking for certainly qualified for that. It quickly got boring again, though. Nothing else changed for long stretches of time. Just a patch of darkness with a bright laser light peeking around it. The only excitement was when their exhaustive measurements indicated that the dark blob was very slowly growing. It wasn't long after that that the idea came to them, and once they had it, they felt foolish for not thinking of it earlier. They had accepted that the light was artificial, assuming that someone must be trying to communicate with them. Now they had taken the black object to be made by the same people who were behind the light. They couldn't believe it took them so long to put the two together, but now it was obvious that the object blocking the light must be a light sail. Once they realized it, everything fell into place. The blinking that first drew their attention to it was caused when the alignment of the beam wandered off true, then was corrected for. Eventually the beam got bigger than the sail. No matter how tight it was, the beam would spread slightly with distance. The wandering and course corrections continued, accounting for the variations in intensity after the light became continuous. The crescent effect must be caused by the beam being just slightly off-center with the sail. The light was leaking around one side of it. From a distance it would still look like a point source, but once they got close enough they were able to see that it was asymmetrical. They had been sending daily reports with collated data and commentary, but now they started streaming everything back to the planet in real time. This was what they came out here for. This was why they had spent over 20 years traveling so far from home. Now maybe they could get some of the answers people were looking for. Every telescope on the ship was trained on the artifact, but they weren't getting much information. After discussion with home, they decided that they would try to make contact again. They spent 2 days composing what would be the most important message ever sent, much of the time trying to decide what medium to send it in. In the end, they opted for a broad-spectrum radio signal carrying their greetings and welcome, along with a few simple mathematical progressions. They didn't expect the visitor to understand the content of the message, but they were hoping they would get the gist and reply in kind. They waited a full day and got no response at all. That settled it. Their telescopes had managed to reveal another shadow attached to the light sail as it occulted background stars. They naturally assumed it was a ship, and, allowing for perspective, it appeared to be about 1/50th as long as the light sail was across. But they couldn't estimate its actual size, or even how far away it was. They decided it was time to do some radar sounding. They were disappointed when they got no echo, but they soon realized that the lack of information was, in this case, a form of information. It showed that the thing coming toward them had to be enormous to be visible at such a distance. They did some calculations, as did the people back home. They factored in the bits of data they had, made some reasonable estimates for what was missing, and came up with some numbers. They were all over the graph, but a good many of them formed a cluster, and they agreed it was a good first approximation. It was astounding, almost unbelievable, but so was the fact that it was crossing interstellar space. If they were right, then the sail was about 1,000 kilometers across. That would make the vessel 20 kilometers long. Once they had an estimate of its size, that gave them an indication of its distance. Some more guesses and logical assumptions put its speed at about 5% of the speed of light. The implications of that shocked them. Assuming that all their calculations were correct, the mysterious visitor, an enigma for decades, was only a few months away. Even if they were wrong, it was surely not more than a year or two. They sprang into action. If they did nothing, the two ships would hurtle past each other at a sizable fraction of the speed of light. They had to reverse thrust. Even at full power, it looked as if they would overshoot, but they had to make the effort anyway. Over the next few months, while their ship tried to burn off its speed, they continued to examine the approaching behemoth. As it slowly resolved itself in their telescopes, They thought they were able to detect a slow change in its speed as well. It was reducing. It was barely discernible, but over time it showed itself to be real. The conclusion they reached, along with the people back home, was that the visitor was aiming to drop into their solar system. Everyone was watching it unfold in the continuous stream of data and images coming back from the ship. That meant there were many eyes to share the experience and many brains to try to figure it out. So when they had an anomaly, instead of it simply being dismissed as a glitch, there was a much more interesting explanation brought forward. There were a lot of people throughout the system who had experienced just about everything there was to experience in space. One thing they did a lot of was look at objects from a distance. Not quite the distances the envoys were subject to out by the heliopause, but still pretty good analogues. When they heard that the visitor changed shape, that its outline now differed by 1 or 2 pixels on one side, they had an idea what it might be. They had often seen the same thing as 2 objects, one large and one small, merged or separated at the limits of their visibility. The small one they couldn't see at all, and the large one just seemed to subtly change shape. They guessed that a smaller vessel had detached from the main one. That piqued everyone's interest, but it turned out like all the previous times. While it looked as if they were finally going to learn something about the visitor, there followed another period where they were given nothing new. All through the system, people's attention turned back to everyday matters, and they only glanced occasionally at the feed being relayed to them. Periodically, the envoys tried the radar again, never expecting anything. They knew how far apart they were, and they understood the inverse square rule. They only kept trying from an abundance of caution. They didn't want to miss anything, and because it was better than just waiting. Their attention to detail paid off for them. One day they got a little blip, then nothing for the rest of the day. The following day the blip was back and, after a bit of intermittence, it stayed. They got plenty of information now. They had distance and speed. They could compute its course. They knew its size. The target on their radar screen wasn't the big vessel. This one was only about 100 meters long, not much bigger than the envoy's own ship. This must be what they saw separating from the big ship before. This little ship must have been sent to make contact. Abruptly, the data stream started to break up, and there was a final desperate voice message from the envoys. "They're attacking us! They're—" And they were gone.